Hello everybody, welcome to the latest edition of the Royal Blue podcast. My name is Joe Thomas, I'm the Echo's Everton FC correspondent, and alongside me we've got regular contributor Gavin Buckland and we've got my colleague Chris Beesley. Been another busy week in the world of Everton, it always is, of course it is, and since we last spoke, Everton have finally started kicking the ball around for the first time, although probably far too soon for most of us, given what they've put everybody through for the last two seasons. We'll start back in Switzerland from a couple of days ago. Chris, you were obviously out there, had the privilege of being out there, the only reporter from anywhere in the world who happened to be watching that game. You know, obviously Feather and the Echoes both. Of course it is, allows us to give some insight that others aren't able to do. Chris, just talk us through, we don't need to talk about the game, just so we'll come on to the game, but I think it was very clear in Sean Dyche's comments after the game and some of the players that you spoke to and some of the interviews that have already been published that obviously the game itself wasn't important. The scoreline, the tactics wasn't deemed as a barometer of where Everton are at this stage. What was more, this was a camp that was more about fitness and more about kind of team bonding to a certain extent. I know they had Wednesday afternoon off to kind of do those type of things. Having been over there in the camp for most of the time that Everton were out there and having been up close and personal with the likes of Dwight McNeil, James Tarkowski, Nathan Patterson, Steve Stone and Sean Dyche, of course. I mean, what did you make of everything? How do you think last week went? And how do you think that Everton thought last week went?
I think they genuinely thought it went very well. It's a facility that Sean Dyche has been to before with Burnley a few years ago now, but he obviously likes it, and some of the comments he was saying is that the people there, they can't do enough for you. Really welcoming, I mean, very plush facilities as well. It was rather different than where I was staying, but a bit of a workout myself going up and down those hills every day. It was great views overlooking Lake Geneva or Lake Lac Léman, I think as the French call it, because we were on the French side, remember, at that point in the Evian area. And there's plenty of time for work, rest and play, really, because they were, obviously, like you say, they were working them very hard on the training ground. Facilities, I understand they were actually used by Germany at the last Euros, so see first-class facilities there. And a lot of the young lads as well. It's just Sean Dyche mentioned to me after the game that it's a big physical step for them to get their bodies ready for the physical demands of the Premier League, but they were all mucking in and playing their part. James Tarkowski said as well that he felt that the young lads had certainly sort of stepped up to the plate and sort of really put a shift in over the week. So yeah, it was all about building that physical fitness ahead of the season, and that was another thing James Tarkowski said. We might come on to that. How Everton aim to be the fittest team in the Premier League. That's a badge that they want. So yeah, it seemed to be a really good setup. Steve Stone said to me, you know, he's been on plenty of these sort of trips before, and as first team coach, he thought it was just right, just the correct length of time, sort of facilities that were on offer, because the last thing you want is a lot of these young men sort of climbing up the wall with boredom and getting up to mischief because they're not happy in the camp. But it didn't seem like that at all. It seemed like a really fruitful week for them.
So they had double sessions training on the Tuesday, double sessions on the Thursday as well. So clearly worked hard as well in the club interview after the game on Friday night as well. You could almost see the smile in the back of Sean Dyche's eyes as he kind of like relished how much he'd made them work. And of course there's more of that this week. It's Gaffer's Day, the notorious Gaffer's Day on Tuesday. Then after that piece I wrote yesterday, Sunday, that being the mindset will switch to a little bit more starting to take tactical things on, tactical and technical elements into training as they start to build up into the season, which is obviously less than a month away. Gav, we know that in things like the transfer market, Everton aren't in a situation at the moment where they can necessarily be proactive. They have to react to what's going on. They have to see how the dominoes fall elsewhere and basically try and get themselves in as good a position to pounce where possible. It seems, and I think we probably all anticipated that this was likely to be the case, but from the little that we have seen already of Dyche in pre-season, it sounds like his main focus is, to use a Dyche bingo call phrase, control the controllables. Chris referred to it there, being the fittest team in the Premier League, or one of them. Does it give you a sense of reassurance that we seem to have a first-team coaching network that want to focus their priorities on what it is that they can control, and fitness is something they can control. Dyche, Wone, Stone, etc., they can't decide whether or not Everton have £40 million to go out and spend on a new striker. They can't spend money or pull in favours to fill in the holes that we know that they've got in that squad. But what they can do is they can do everything that's possible to make these lads, put them in a position where they can fight better, faster, harder, stronger than anybody else. And although that being a cliche, although that being something that I know we would all say, oh, football is a simple game, and we'd all expect that of every single management team and every single squad, I think we can see the physical evidence of what's going on at Everton's training camps, and perhaps a way that we couldn't see it with Lampard's last summer. Does that give you any reassurance, or do you actually just look at this and think, well, this should be a given, and surely every training camp across the other 19 Premier League teams at the summer is going to be the same makeup?
A bit of both, really. I think I was thinking about it. They say armies are the most vulnerable when they're in retreat, aren't they? And for the last 2 years, Everton have been in retreat as a club, hadn't they, as a first team. And I think at the moment we've actually stopped retreating. We're sort of now like we're digging, you know, like what you're talking about there, Joe. It's like we're digging in now again, aren't we, to defend or whatever you would call it, to protect ourselves, and that encompasses that type of stuff you're talking about. It is a cliche, I know, but it is like doing the basics, like getting the players fit. You can control your tactics as well, and you just get the impression that okay, we need players, but if we can get the most of what we've got, then that would be very as a team. You know, that's very advantageous. And you think, and I get what Dyche is doing. I think that's quite a smart move there. Rather than preparing to bring 3 or 4 players in and saying, oh, you know, this is how we're going to play, and this is what we need, is get the most, first of all, out of what you've got. And I see, you know, what we said and what Steve Stone said, that's what they're going to be doing, you know, in pre-season. And I think that's pretty, get the basics right for the start.
I like what you say there, the way you kind of reference that, because you kind of, it has felt like a club that's been in retreat, been on the back foot for a long time. And I think it probably, when you look at the wider context in which the clubs operate at the minute, I think it probably still is. But in terms of Finch Farm and on the pitch, it did feel like there was a bit of a sea change when Dyche came in. And it may well be that if Everton go on and have an all right season this season, if they do stay up, we know that this time next year things should start to look a little bit easier. Some of the more expensive, difficult financial years drop off the reckoning. Obviously, a lot more of the onerous contracts all of a sudden disappear from the books, or Everton have the opportunity to let go of the likes of Gabamin, Gomez, and a couple of others. And also, obviously, we'll have the move on the horizon to the new stadium. So if Everton do start next season, things can start to maybe look a little bit more positive. There's light at the end of the tunnel. They've just got to get there. If they do get there, you can't help but feel that maybe we'll look back on February, the appointment of Dyche, the rallying around him, the simplicity of what he did, of just trying to clarify everything that they were doing to make it as effective an opportunity for Everton to stay up as possible. It does feel like we might look back on that and that'd be the turning point.
Yeah, definitely. You don't get the impression that, you know, we've spoken before, you know, they could sell a player, but there's no need to sell a big player at this stage by the looks of things, unless we wanted to make some big signings ourselves. So as I say, you do get the impression that we formed as a unit, as a team, a defensive line again in the battle, rather than just being constantly in retreat and on. Yeah. You know, and that's when, like an army, that's when you're most vulnerable as a club. When you're retreating and selling stuff up players, and there's all the intrigue around that. That you're vulnerable on the pitch as well, and a sense that time has stopped. You know, during a close season. Not what you think, Chris, but I think that time stopped.
Yeah, like you say, it does feel different. You know, like you said, than on the Frank Lampard and the way that Sean Dyche is. He was obviously when he spoke to me after the game, you could sense, you know, a realism or a frustration, however you want to call it. You know, the fact he was saying that they are active in the market, and he made the point of the fact that money talks and money gets these deals over the line. You know, the insinuation being that some deals that they might have tried to get through haven't gone through. But like you say, the controllables, the fitness levels. I mean, it's not just a platitude, is it? He's not just saying, well, of course, every Premier League team would like to be the fittest team in the Premier League. But with Everton, there seems a strategy behind that. There's a process to where they're going to get that. It's not just an empty gesture.
It's really interesting as well, because I think Dyche hinted quite a few times towards the back end of last season, as the players were going down like flies in the running, the games got more and more important and the squad got thinner and thinner. there were a couple of times he alluded to the idea that he didn't think he'd have those problems had he managed that side over pre-season and had that team for a full year, as opposed to coming in and having to do what he did and firefight and things like that. Gav, do you think that Everton, perhaps under Lampard, lacked a clear identity as to what it is that they were and were trying to achieve and where they're going to? And do you think that Dyche has instilled that in the squad and that might be a good thing?
Yeah, well, we spoke about Frank on Friday. I think not the lack of identity is probably Frank's lack of identity, isn't it? About what he wanted to do and how he wanted to implement those plans within the first team. And we spoke about that on Friday, that perhaps he didn't know how to do that because of his inexperience. And I think the difference is Dyche has got all that experience, hasn't he, compared to Lampard. And dare I say, he's probably, the type of players he's got, with one or two exceptions, are the type of players he's worked with before in football. So in some respects, this is familiar territory for him. As you say, Chris, he'd been there before, hadn't he, with Burnley, I presume. So yeah, I think it's the easiest thing for a manager to do when they come in, and we spoke about this before, is the players are unfit. I think every manager who's ever taken over a football club within the first 3 months will say the squad that took over, I was surprised by their lack of fitness. Every manager has said that. It's like a bingo card, isn't it? They tick that off. But you suspect with Dyche's comments that there was probably an element of truth in there. In that Frank was probably a little bit more focused on the technical side of the game. And
it's not a lack of fitness, probably a lack of physical resilience.
Yeah. And that's probably down to Frank's coaching team as well, isn't it? And the people around him. I think this is Dyche's first sort of period of time he's had to work with the players. And I think you'd probably see a different Everton team in August than what you'd saw in February, March. Yeah. I think that's, and it was interesting that Steve. I thought the Steve Stonehenge was really good about when he was talking about players' fitness. Yeah. And sort of like where players are, and understand where players are compared to others, and that came across as fitness is so important, within the coaching setup, and I know every club says that you've got to get everybody super fit and stuff like that, but sometimes in certain games you can bridge gaps, can't you, by your physical effort. Saw that in the Arsenal game, didn't you? Dyche's first game is a classic example of that. If you work hard, you get results, and I think that's what they'll be doing this season. I think.
It's about knowing where your boundaries are, where your limits are,
yeah.
How much you can get away with. What players can get away with 80% and still be effective, and what needs to be higher.
But not only boundaries physically, but in terms of ability as well. And that's where I don't think Frank understood the boundaries of the player's ability.
Yeah, I think when we look back at we look back with hindsight, wasn't necessarily saying this at the time, and I still think that Frank could potentially be a good coach. I actually think that a good move for Frank would probably be something like the under-21s at Chelsea, where he could be a role model as well. But without the pressure, and he could maybe build some of those young players that are coming up, big names in the game like he's been. He can grow tactically as they grow tactically, that kind of thing, before he came back into a first team job. But it was almost as if the principles under Frank were fluid, and I probably fell into this trap a little bit. We spoke about this from the pod before. I think coming out of the season when Everton stayed up with the Crystal Palace game, I think there was a perception from a lot of people inside and outside the club, and I count myself within this, of thinking, almost wanting to write the season off before as a one-off. A case of the Everton just got themselves in a bit of a relegation spiral. We had the decline, they had the appointment of Benitez, then they had the decline under Benitez, and mess that got themselves in, the injuries that then started to build up throughout the season. And I almost just thought that the squad that Everton finished that season with would naturally be maybe 10 points better off next season, just by virtue of having had the chance to have got through it, got to the summer, had a psychological reset, had a fitness reset, and come back fitter. Obviously, that wasn't the case. We now know that they just weren't quite good enough to be able to naturally come back in and be a competitive, effective Premier League football, and obviously not with Frank in charge. I think where Frank got a little bit caught was, and you can almost see it playing out in real time. Remember the game at Leeds when he moved to a flat back four from a flat back five? It was that idea of maybe, wait a minute, maybe I want us to be a little bit more progressive than a backs against the wall. We've got to fight to stay in the Premier League this season. I think that we can be a little bit more expansive. Thinking that games such as performances such like the Crystal Palace 3-0 one could be a consistent theme, when in reality we look back and that was a one-off that was, it might have come along once every 7 or 8 games at best, but everything in between was, he hadn't done the homework, he hadn't done built the solid foundation from which you can then expand to go on and play that football, which is something that Dyche talks about a lot. Where he talks about how he wants to, he would love to create a side that can go out and play progressive football, but he knows he needs to do the basics first, he needs to build a team that can to do the simple things well first. Yeah,
well, he wants it like a 7 on 10 performance every week, doesn't he? Really,
of course.
That's what he wants, and I totally get that. And you as I say, I don't want to go on the sort of battlefield scenario too much, but you get the impression we are digging in. We dug another trench now to defend it, and I think that's a really important point for us to take.
Royal Blue, the military history podcast.
Yeah. But bearing in mind what we said so far, just as a kind of go off on a slight tangent, and we'll talk about some of the other issues around this. And we expect there to be, regardless of the scenario, if the circumstance Everton are operating, we expect there to be more incomings over the course of summer. It's hard. I mean, I know there weren't any in January, and it was impossible to see how they couldn't have done that. But surely there'll be some this summer. But with everything that we're talking about with fitness, do you think that there is enough quality within the Everton squad as it currently stands for them to stay up in the Premier League by making the most of, if Dyche gets every ounce of fitness and quality out of the players that he has got, where do you think Everton currently sit in terms of, how competitive they'll be next season? Chris, I'll go to you, sorry.
Given that it's the 17th of July, the squad as it stands, I'd be very concerned, even with high fitness level, given, as we spoke about last week, it's been about six first team players out the door if you include Andros Townsend, who didn't play because of injury last season. Only Ashley Young, as encouraging as he is and as experienced as he is, a 38-year-old through the door. So as it stands, I'd be very concerned. I think they need more, especially in the attacking areas. I mean, you could obviously get more with Dominic Calvert-Lewin. He's played fewer than 50% of the matches both of the last 2 seasons. So if you get him fit and firing, obviously that's a big boost. If you somehow get a tune out of Neil Mopay, he interestingly played part of a strike partnership on Friday evening. But then you've got all the issues that go with Everton only having 2 men in the middle, and that's gone with that last season. So, I mean, Everton ended up making 8 signings last summer, and there's still another 6 weeks left of an active transfer window, and seriously want there to be more attacking options in there in the shape of new faces. But as it stands, I'd be concerned, but obviously we have still got another 6 weeks.
Would you share those concerns
window
as well, Gav?
Yeah, absolutely. For much as said about, I can see the merits of what Dyche is doing. I mean, and some of this is down to the clubs around you, isn't it? The clubs who come up, how competitive they are about whether you go down. I mean, the one thing I'd say is, and this is the concern I've got is, Villa are very much a club similar to Everton, aren't they, in terms of size and history and stuff like that. And when they went down in 2016, they had 2 seasons getting in 30 odd points and stayed up. Then the 3rd season they went down because
3 strikes and you're out.
Because they were getting over the expense of the Randy Lerner years. So there's a similarity with Everton and Villa, from about 7 or 8 years ago. So as it stands, you'd be very concerned, and quite rightly so. And we do need players, but you've got to get the most of the players that are there at the moment. Going back to the Lampard thing, I picked up on this on Friday, is that alarming comment about players who are bar lowerers, and I can't see Dyche allowing for that. I can't see people if they're swinging the legs a little bit. I don't think that's going to happen under Dyche, where maybe it did happen under Lampard. And I think, as we stand at the moment, as Chris said, middle of July, of course, but why wouldn't you? It's just a natural thing, You've had 2 seasons in the 30s, points marks. You've escaped relegation. You've got less points in the 2nd season. Well, you actually gone from 39 to 36. So the trajectory is downwards. That needs addressing, and the first thing needs addressing is get the best out of the current squad and get some players in. I was interested to see the first tranche of Premier League money was paid to clubs, wasn't it, on Friday? And I'm just wondering whether I'm just wondering whether that'll kickstart a few bit of movement, not only with with Everton, but other clubs that it then impacts on Everton. Because that's why Declan Rice got sold over the weekend, wasn't it? Because they had the money in the
literally a cash flow issue.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering whether, in terms of, we've spoken about Everton's cash issues, obviously, whether that'll help us.
Sales will also be key, and obviously I think one thing that you mentioned, the delay. Obviously, Declan Rice has been. It's clear that he was going to go to Arsenal for some time, but obviously only got signed off for the weekend, and you very much feel as if a lot of the Premier League business and perhaps a lot of the European business has been waiting for a few dominoes to fall, perhaps that, and now all of a sudden West Ham are going to have a lot of money. They're ambitious, they're in Europe next season. They're a club that, for all that they ended up in a struggle last season, they're on a much surer footing, it feels, than someone like Everton, and have got the ability to go out and spend some of that money probably, and it'll be interesting to see the knock-on impact that has. Will they, for instance, obviously they've been linked to someone that we know that they have an interest in, Amadou Onana, because obviously Everton would pip them to him last season. They now have a big gap in centre midfield to fill and a lot of money to spend. Even you would think that they'd be able to come in, if they had the interest for Amadou Onana, you'd think they'd be able to come in with a price Everton would be interested in and still have a lot of money left over from the Declan Rice deal. So that's a really interesting, obviously linked to Alex Iwobi a little bit as well. So I mean, we might start to see that knock-on effect as well, in the sense that some of those deals that have been mooted, if there is interest and if there is any seriousness in that interest, might start to kind of come, and that might open up a few doors for Everton, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, absolutely, or opportunities, and I think we've spoken. We don't talk about Everton's finances again, but you forget, like, during the summer, you've got to pay players. We talk about having money for like transfers. We've got to pay £13 million a month goes out of the club for players alone every month. You've got to be like payments to clubs for like Onana and McNeil. So in that context, I think that's what, and we're not alone with that, by the way. I think the first payments to the Premier League money on Friday acts as a big transformative thing in terms of people's buying power, and I think you'll see the market picking up a lot more now.
And the other things as well is two other things that obviously also kind of add to that momentum in terms of the transfer activity. Is one, we'll start over the next week or two now to see the final players join up with their squads that have been off on extended breaks because of international duty. Obviously, we know that that means Damari Gray, Jarrad Branthwaite, and James Garner coming back to Everton at some point next. I don't know if it'll be this week or the week after. It was unclear when in Dyche's comments last week. But obviously, that will then help them to decide what to do with Damari Gray. Wants to have be able to have a proper chat with the player, because we know there's interest in him. Similarly, Wilfred Gnonto, who Everton linked with at Leeds. Well, he joins back up with the Leeds squad either today. We're speaking on Monday or tomorrow. Just on that, I think Everton's interest is genuine. But like we said, I think on Friday, Leeds are very resistant to a sale, and I think they're operating from a position of strength there, on an affordable wage. He's on a long-term contract. Everton have had discussions, informal talks about prices for him, and I think at the minute Leeds see Everton's valuation as far, far too low. And if I'm honest, at this stage of the window, without further outgoings or something changing from Leeds' perspective, I'm not sure if they'll quite be able to get to a point where Leeds can actually take serious interest. But one thing that might happen, of course, is we don't know what the player's going to do and whether he's going to start pushing to leave, and the wheels might turn on motion for things like that as they start coming back. So a lot of the speculations come from Italy, which is obviously the national team that Gnonto represents. So that'll be an interesting one. Chris, it's impossible to talk about next season. It's impossible to talk about strength and prospects and hopes without going back to that Dominic Calvert-Lewin question. And one of the things you spoke to Steve Stone about Dominic Calvert-Lewin, and I read the comments talking about perhaps where he might be in terms of his fitness pathway at the moment. And I kind of thought they were quite interesting, and they were probably a little bit open to interpretation. My reading of it was that Dominic Calvert-Lewin may well still be a little bit away from playing football for Everton, and perhaps involvement in pre-season friendlies. And I must admit, when I looked at the words and the way he said them, I had a little bit of concern as to whether or not Dominic Calvert-Lewin might be touch and go for the beginning of the season. Obviously, even though words in black and white can often look very different to words when you're saying it, having been a person in that conversation, and I know you would have thought carefully about how you worded things and how you would have set up the quotes that Steve Stone used and things like that. Of course you would. But I'm just interested to see what your interpretation of that conversation was, and just whether you got a sense as to where they think the pathway is and where he is in the stage of recovery for Dominic Calvert-Lewin. Yeah.
Well, what you've also got to throw into the mix, it's not a major thing, that Dom was actually one of those players who'd had a sickness bug as well last week, wasn't it? And he'd actually been kept away from the other players. But yeah, I mean,
sorry, who was it that had a sickness bug? 'Cause I knew that there had been a sickness bug. I wasn't sure.
I was told it was Dom had it, and it was Stanley Mills as well.
Right, I see.
So they were a couple of players who were suffering with the sickness, and yeah, Steve Stone said that the idea was that they want to have him fit for a longer period of the season. It's not the be all and end all that Dominic Calvert-Lewin is starting that first match of the season against Fulham. I mean, he certainly wasn't ruled out for that, but the idea being it's about the long-term effects, the greater good, really, because as we've spoken about, 2 seasons on the bounce now, he's played less than half the matches, and if you do that for a third year, I mean, you're really not getting as much out of the player as you should be. And he's talking about something that the manager's spoken about with me in the past as well, that at 26 now, he's approaching a point in his career where he should be sort of learning his own body, really. When you're younger, you're maybe not too sure what you can do and what you can't do and just how far you push yourself. But when you're getting sort of in your peak years now, as it were, you should be able to sort of gauge what is a knock and what is just like a not a strain, but a discomfort necessary. You're never 100% eye as a professional footballer. No. So what you can do and what you can't do without actually doing any damage, and once you sort of learn that sort of process and you get more sort of confident in that respect, you can go out there and you're less tentative, because it's been a hamstring again, hasn't it, with Dom? And you can actually, go for that sprint without wincing, without having that doubt in the back of your mind about where you're at. So yeah, we talked about the process with that and the hopes that Dom can actually self-manage a lot more in that respect, in that he'll be able to gauge what he can and what he can't do, and sort of have less sort of apprehension about when he's coming back from an injury, just about how far he can push himself.
Gav, that's obviously the approach is a positive, because it sounds like Dyche's team is aware of where Dominic Calvert-Lewin's at and want to make sure that they're not focused on short-term goals of having him back for a day. They want him to get back, and when he's back, to be back properly. Yeah. But obviously that's got to be another concern, because we've spoken already about the positives that having a simplicity and clarity of approach brings to a side such as Everton, where they don't have many options. Obviously there's a huge difference, as we saw mainly at the beginning of last season under Lampard. There's a huge difference between playing to Dominic Calvert-Lewin's strengths and playing to Neal Maupay, who was the only other senior experienced forward at the club's strength. And that's going to be a little bit of a problem in terms of the approach over the next few weeks, if they have to adopt a kind of dual strategy of being able to both work on a style that works for Neal Maupay and work on a style that works best for Dominic Calvert-Lewin.
Yeah, I think.
And of course, the longer it takes before they get another striker in, and you would think that one of the things that the type of profile of strikers that would make sense would be to find someone that matches Dominic Calvert-Lewin's attributes. But the longer that goes on, the more concerning that'll be, because the more time that'll end up being spent on what's essentially Plan B, and that Plan B that we don't know is effective because Maupay struggled.
Yeah, and you end up with Damari Gray playing up front again, don't you? Really, I mean, I thought it was a really good interview, that Chris, in terms of like the type of, that's why pre-season tours, you get them type of interviews, don't you? I thought it was really interesting, and it was. I share your concern you said at the start, Joe, was that reading that interview, they spoke about him being fit, didn't he? Getting him fit.
That was the phrase he used, fit.
And you got the impression that actually that there's not an expectation that he's going to be there on the first game of the season, as well as Patterson and Coleman as well. By the way, when they read that, I don't think that was interesting.
To be fair, young Patterson was playing Friday night.
Playing Friday night, but he's still got injury issues, hasn't he? Yeah, and I think you spoke about Dyche going to be working on tactics. Well, actually, Everton's tactics and setup with Calvert-Lewin in the team and setup with Maupay in the team are two completely different things. At Brighton, Maupay plays in a 3-4-3, where Dyche doesn't really play 4-3-3 or 3-4-3, does he really? He plays 4-5-1 or whatever you call it. And so it is a different setup, and Maupay struggled when we tried to play like we have done with Calvert-Lewin. And if you change that dynamic to suit Maupay, then you lose some of like you know what say Wobie does or what McNeil does, and it's a quandary really, isn't it? And it just shows you that perhaps the purchase of Maupay could have been better thought out. I think we'd all agree that, because I don't
damning,
think
really.
Yeah, that's not really worked. What I would say is perhaps they never thought that Calvert-Lewin's injury issues would be as long-standing as what they eventually were 12 months ago.
Which, but if that was the case, is if we're honest, is also a little bit damning as well. Bear in mind what he'd been through.
Yeah. Which is probably thinking, not you're looking at him, and it's just a standing agenda item on the podcast. The Calvert-Lewin. We spoke about him last week, didn't he? And also as well. Stone spoke about the psychological thing about having. He said he'd had hamstring injuries himself, and he says constantly, when he had hamstring injuries, constantly during the game, is my hamstring going to go here or feeling it like it? I thought that was quite interesting as well, and it's going to cause us an issue because they are, as strikers go, and would you class Maupay as a centre forward even possibly? They're like at the complete opposite ends of the spectrum, aren't they, in terms of their strengths and weaknesses, and that does cause us an issue. And I assume if we were going for a striker, it would be somebody like Calvert-Lewin. Is that what we're saying?
It feels like it would make sense. It feels like, obviously, first and foremost, it would be good to have someone that could compete with Calvert-Lewin. Obviously that ups everybody's standards, but I think if we're being perfectly honest, that type of striker who's got a track record would be difficult for Everton to obtain. But one thing that I think we're all in agreement on and have been over previous podcasts is the fact that Everton can't go into the season gambling on Calvert-Lewin's fitness, and the most sensible way to set up for a team that probably is in the situation Everton are financially is to find someone as close to a profile as Dominic Calvert-Lewin as possible, so that it becomes interchangeable. And okay, they might not have the experience or the same amount of quality that Calvert-Lewin has, but what it does mean is you don't have to then adapt to a completely different style of play, which is the big problem that Everton had in those first 6 or 7 games of last season when Calvert-Lewin picked up that knee injury. Then they didn't have a striker to play with, had Gordon playing as a false nine for a lot of it, and then they did bring Maupay in, and I felt sorry a little bit for Maupay. I felt sorry a lot for Maupay, if I'm being perfectly honest. I thought, one, that he was brought in without there being a clear plan necessarily for him, and two, he kind of, bearing in mind, for a start, he hadn't had a pre-season because he was expecting to leave Brighton, and then had that debacle over the fact that Everton signed him just before the bank holiday, so he wasn't registered to be able to play for the league, make his debut against Leeds. And then, if you remember, there was that awkward autumn period for Everton, going from middle of September through to beginning of November, spanned a couple of international breaks as well, where there was a kind of won't he play with Dominic Calvert-Lewin. He kept coming back, being on the cusp of coming back, playing, and then coming off early, or then missing the next game. And it just meant that there was just no real. It meant that it felt like Calvert-Lewin was always close enough to play, and it almost felt like Lampard was starting every week, going, right, Monday, Dom, reckon you'll be fit to play? Yeah, okay, we'll work to that plan. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday afternoon. Oh, looks like it might be a bit tricky. Okay, well, Maupay will have to come in, but we've worked on different tactics and it felt just so disjointed when you saw what Everton had on the pitch, and it feels like that Everton can't do that again this season, because that would just be daft. It would defy logic to leave themselves in that position. So they've either got to come up with a different strategy to work with the players that they either have got or the players that they can get in. Or they've got to work to a strategy. If Sean Dyche thinks that the most effective way of playing is to play in for Dominic Calvert-Lewin, they then have to have somebody that can easily replace Dominic Calvert-Lewin and what he brings to the team in the summer transfer window. One of the players that I think people say fits that, I think, is El Bilal Toure Almeria, who haven't been heavily linked to. But he has a €40 million release clause. He has a club that wants to sell him because they want to use the money to be able to fund wider improvements to the squads. They only just stayed up in La Liga last season, but I think they're very much engaged at the minute. They say that Everton have been putting bids in. I think there was a little bit of interest in them, but I think it's a very, very much a case at the minute of Everton's name being used to try and push the price up, whether or not in 5 or 6 weeks' time. Almeria lost their main striker on the very last day of the last summer transfer window, and it massively impacted their season. So I think they have a fear of avoiding that situation this summer. So there may be a point where in a couple of weeks' time they can meet in the middle. But again, we're talking about fees that at the moment probably aren't within Everton's reach. And for a side that wants to raise money, they probably don't want it heavily in instalments. They want upfront payments, which again is a difficulty for Everton.
Which is not going to happen with Everton, is it really? Yeah. I mean, it just shows you the difference. I mean, the club has quite rightly got stick about like buying players and not, or, players they bought and players they should have bought and so on. But you forget how difficult. I was thinking about this. How difficult it is to buy a player. If you want to buy a player who replicates, say, Dominic Calvert-Lewin, you've got to identify the player first of all, haven't you? Then that player needs to be available. The player needs to want to join you. You need to get a transfer fee that's both clubs are happy with. You've got to get a salary package that both clubs are happy with. There's a whole hope, and that player is happy playing in the role you want him to play. There's 6 or 7 filters you've got to go through, haven't you? In terms of buying a player, if you're looking for a specific type of player, and that's very difficult. You can have the best scouting system in the world. You also need a lot
of luck.
Yeah,
I think one of the big sliding doors moments of last season was Everton were essentially very, very close to signing Mohamed Kudus from Ajax.
Yeah.
And obviously that didn't get over the line, but they got very close to selling him. Then all of a sudden Man United had such a catastrophic start to the season that they panicked, paid the world for Anthony, paid went so much money for Anthony that Ajax couldn't turn it down. They can't rubbing their hands with glee, but all of a sudden Anthony goes. Ajax don't want to lose another forward, so at the start of the season, shut the door on Mohamed Kudus. He ends up going in. I think he scored 4 or 5 goals Champions League. Scores against Ajax. Scores for Ajax against Liverpool at Anfield. Great goal. Had a good World Cup as well. And all of a sudden he's gone from being a player that was on the cusp of joining Everton for a loan with an obligation or an option to buy. All of a sudden you look at that and thinking great business. Just imagine where Everton would be. They had him. So all of a sudden he's become overnight one of the hottest prospects in European football, and all of a sudden he's probably unobtainable for someone like Everton, and he's at Champions League changing club level interest.
They're unfortunate in that respect, but then you flip it round and look at the Mopé signing, and it's through no fault of Mopé's at all, but just seems totally ill-suited. And the hindsight of everyone's got 2020 vision with hindsight and looking at it retrospectively, but it just wasn't the fit. It was almost like, well, here's a Premier League proven player who's available. I think Everton have got to get smarter with their recruitment, got to look in different areas. I mean, look at the clubs like Brighton and Hove Albion, Brentford in recent years operating with fewer resources than Everton. They've been a lot smarter. Obviously, they just talk about the ways they go about their recruiting.
I think that's a point worth making, though, isn't it? That their scouting database, because of the owners' sort of business interests, is far wider, isn't it, and far more detailed.
They're also in a slightly different position as well, aren't they? Because I think very much that as impressive as their rises have been, it's been a rise that's taken place without the pressure of.
Absolutely.
They've been for the benefit of come up from mid-table championship clubs that have built their success on that model, as opposed to Everton, where Everton have always had more to lose because of where they are, and also Brighton and Brentford, and this is Everton's fault. It's completely Everton's fault. But they just simply don't have the money to take those gambles, do they? They don't have the money. You look at Wilfred Gnonto, signed for about £4 million from, for Leeds from Zurich last summer. All of a sudden, Everton want him, and a few other clubs do. And you look at that, you think great bit of business. But do Everton have those £4 or £5 million to gamble on now? Obviously, they did last summer in the sense that they signed Neil Mopé for a deal that's probably 4 times as much as that. But clearly, priorities have changed. I think the recruitment teams.
It's like lazy's maybe an unfair word to use, but like you said, not being as savvy as some of their competitors as their rivals.
I think Everton's recruitment department, in fairness on the farewell, I think it is quite tuned in. I think it is working hard. I think the reality is that they're just operating in an environment where it's very, very difficult for them to. Obviously, they don't have a say on who presses the final button or what money's available and what isn't. They can only come up with the players, and if you look at some of the players that they've come up with over the last 18 months, well, some of them have turned out to be pretty decent. The
some of the signings last summer were good, like Anana, Garner, Tarkovsky were good signings. Are we saying here that actually, and it sounds probably not what you would expect, but actually you could see it working. 4 or 5 Ashley Young type signings would be actually a pretty decent result for where we stand at the moment during the summer. 1 year, 2 year deals for players who are proven.
I say like half a dozen 38-year-olds.
Yeah. Well, if they can play like Ashley Young kind of 38, wouldn't there? Is that what you're saying? Is that like that's the type of thing we should be.
I think what I'm trying to say is, I think obviously Everton had that strategic review 18 months or so ago, and it was heralded at the time by the club as a sea change in thinking. The reality is that it came up with an ideology that's essentially impossible to put into place because the fabric of the club was so chaotic that they just didn't have the resources to follow that. An ideology in the transfer window where you focus on signing young, promising players that could turn out to be world beaters and with big sell-on fees, and also try and development pathways from young players into the first team, only works on two levels. One, if you've got the money to be able to risk it on prospects rather than players that have already got experience and shown they can do it. And two, the first 11 have to be playing week in, week out in a scenario where players can afford to make mistakes and to grow within the first team setup, within that experience. They can have the chance to fail. They can have, a Dyche terminology, the bliss to miss if they're strikers and things like that. They've the freedom to fail at the most senior level, whilst they gain, because that's how you gain experience.
Yeah.
So Everton haven't had that opportunity because they've been operating under such pressure because results have been needed for so long that you simply can't. Tom Cannon looks like he's a very, very good prospect, but you can't start throwing him into games in a scenario where Everton are 2-1 down in a Premier League match playing against experienced defenders and they need to get a result. They might have to this season, but that isn't the ideal scenario for that ideology to operate. So maybe this is the summer where they almost take a row back, and we've talked about the pragmatism and the reality with which Dyche seems to approach the situations. And it very much seems to be a case of this season. It might have to be a case of, as unpalatable it is this isn't a case of a summer transfer window that's planned for the future, for the long-term future of the club. This is a summer transfer window where it's what can Everton most effectively do to survive in the Premier League until that they have that more wider freedom to operate, which might be next summer. And I think you have to look at the idea, and it has to be maybe the likes of a James Tarkowski signing last season and Ashley Young signing this season.
Yeah. It's interesting that, because how long's Dyche got left on his contract this year?
It was a 2.5-year deal, so it's
another two, isn't it?
Another two. So he's got like a short term. This whole thing about what you're talking about there is right. But if your manager's only got like an 18-month contract or 2 years, they're not going to buy players for the good of the team, are they? If funds are limited, that might only bear fruit 3 or 4 years down the line. They want players who are going to be available to you and at their best while you're a manager under contract. I mean, it's human nature, isn't it? Really, you're going to look after number one, so that will inform, I would imagine.
Well, flip that around. Ancelotti had a 4.5-year contract, and he was signing 30-year-olds himself, wasn't he?
But that's answered. Those players, because Ancelotti doesn't develop players, does it? I mean, that's not his style, is it? Really. People say he developed X, Y, and Z, but in the circumstances, those are the players that he wanted. Yeah. But if you're a manager on a limited contract, then you're going to buy players for that contract, aren't you? Really, are you going to work for you? And I think that will also inform, some of our dealings that under Dyche. And I think if we come make 5 or 6 signings that are sorted, I'd say not like identical to Ashley Young types, but of that similar ilk, players who are flexible, are proven, maybe even just a little bit past the best, but that they can do a job for you. I'd say that would be a pretty decent win.
I mean, one thing Everton do need is it's not just quality that they need, it is also numbers, depth. How often did we look at that bench last season and go, there are very, very few players on there that you would look to bring on. I know it's within Dyche's mindset. I spoke to him about this. He isn't someone that likes to make a lot of substitutions. But there wasn't really a great deal of options that he had when he was at Everton to change a game, whether that be to short, on the other occasion where Everton winning games like Nottingham Forest and things like that. There wasn't a lot he could do, bring off the bench with 20 minutes ago and certainly when Everton needed to go for a win or find an equaliser, they were very, very limited in terms of attacking options they could bring off the bench to change a game. And that is probably something that will have to change in Dyche's mindset, because I do think that we are having a bit of a reset into, or we have crossed the Rubicon now with the amount of substitutes, 9 on the bench, 5 that can be used.
Another military history reference for you there.
Yeah, loving it. Loving it. Yeah,
but that's it. We are in a new era of Premier League football now, where games can significantly change. There are 2 games. There's a game for the first 70 minutes, and there's 65, 70 minutes. There's another game for the last 25 minutes. You can effectively, you can change up to half of your starting lineup. And one of the problems that Everton saw, and it became really clear from, I think, Wolves on Boxing Day onwards, and then particularly once other clubs started to use the January transfer market to do this, is that how often would you be sat there at Goodison Park or elsewhere, and you would see the opposition manager have 4 or 5 players starting to warm up on the 55-minute mark, and over the course of the next half an hour, he would strategically bring them on, and it would help to change tactics. They would have a massive impact on how games went. Yeah. Everton just simply, not only could Everton not do that to proactively change the way in which games are played, they also couldn't do it to react to how other teams were changing tactics and personnel.
It seems to happen all the time for me. I mean, it just, like you say, you use that phrase, Joe. Game changers, just not enough game changers. Even if you had options on the bench, wasn't somebody who was going to give you a spark of inspiration or anything like that.
No, and in the end, you just didn't bother making substitutions at all, really, did he? And then that gets into fitness questions and stuff, doesn't it? Because people play 90 a lot, and I just think it would be interesting to see, and I would expect to say, as I say, 4 or 5, signs like Young. But we do need those numbers. Yeah. I mean, if you were saying, centre half, if somebody like Holgate goes, you probably need another experienced Connor Cody type figure, don't we, a centre half, I think. Because Branthwaite is still relatively unproven, isn't he, in the Premier League, though he obviously shows a lot of promise. And so that you could have several podcasts just on who those 5 or 6 signings would fit into the team.
Not Johnny Evans, it seems. Yeah.
No, well, he's had fitness issues himself, hasn't he, Johnny Evans? Yeah, that was an interesting one how that came out, wasn't it, really?
You wonder if that was being said as a threat to some of those players in the thing, wasn't it? That's it. I mean, we haven't got there yet, but obviously Everton have played their first 90 minutes of pre-season now. The game on Friday night, Chris, you were there. Yeah. 2-1 victory over the Swiss second-tier side, Stade Lyonnais. Obviously, you've written about your thoughts extensively on the game, but from having been there, I mean, what did you make of it? Result, performance wasn't necessarily the be-all and end-all, but did you take any positives away from it?
Well, there was, and a lot of youngsters got on the pitch, but I think there's very little we can learn really from the game in terms of taking it on to what we might see from Everton in the Premier League. I suppose what you could say is that it was James Tarkowski and Michael Keane starting as centre-backs. Is that something we're going to see more of this season? Obviously, they played together at Burnley, and Michael Keane actually played over 30 games his first 5 years at Everton. It was only last year when he got frozen out under Frank Lampard.
Obviously, I mean, at the moment, it's hard to see it not. It's hard to see it not being Keane and Tarkowski for Fulham, isn't it?
Yeah. That would be I would imagine. Although obviously Ben Godfrey, who started left back and then went to play centre back, but I'd be with you on that one. That's what I would imagine at this stage. But the fact I said that they lined up 4-4-2, which is something that we don't really imagine seeing in the Premier League, given the problems they had. Fulham of all teams as well. Obviously last season he changed it after 20 minutes when he'd gone 4-4-2 again, because obviously he maybe thought, okay, we got turned over at Manchester United, but Fulham at home might be different, and it wasn't, and he changed that one, so lined up 4-4-2. Maupay and Cannon were obviously starting as the strikers. Maupay gets to play as a 2, but are we going to see that much? And then, like we said, your players coming back on, actually, which was interesting for me doing the player ratings. Keeping up with that, I think I was saying at one point, Everton have made 4 changes here. Sorry, 5. And it was very chaotic in that respect. Joe's mate, Joe Virginia, he got a start in goal. Jordan Pickford was in the stands. So, a few jittery moments early on, but he grew into the game.
Well, he made a big save at the beginning of the second half at 0-0. He did very well, didn't he?
Yeah, to be fair, there he is, straight in there from the Joe Virginia fan club. But even Billy Crellin got on at the end. So a lot of youngsters at the end of the game. And
is it too much to say? When I looked at the starting lineup, what jumped out at me was Joe Virginia, Lewis Warrington, and Tom Cannon. Yeah. Because when you look at where Everton are at the minute, 3 areas where they kind of need to find squad options. and bearing in mind this is a search that's taking place in the transfer market with not very much money, is they need a number 2 because Asmir Begovic is gone.
Yeah.
And you don't, it's difficult, as experienced as Andy Lonergan is at 39, it's difficult to see him as being anything more than number 3 again. They need another centre midfielder. Tom Davies is gone, and albeit he was a fringe player, the fact that they offered him a new contract suggested that they felt that they needed another player. Everton, we anticipate, will play 3 in centre midfield as well, and it may well be the way things are going. Obviously, some of the options that they do have remaining, James Garner may well end up playing a little bit of space at right back. Alex Iwobi, we can play sitting in the centre, but we don't really. It doesn't look as if Dyche necessarily fancies him there, unfortunately. So Lewis Warrington got an opportunity there, and obviously we know about the issues up top. Tom Cannon. It did feel like that there was a degree of, albeit experimentation. It did make sense them 3 players starting, or do you think I'm just reading it? Do you think Dyche was looking at that to see can these players fill those squad slots, or am I just playing too much attention to that?
I think he was. I know we're having a bit of fun there about Joe Virginia, but I think that's an area where we talked about it in the last podcast, a calculated gamble that the hope that Pickford can play most of the season and he can possibly be the number 2. But yeah, definitely looking at them because if you look at the players who were available because they were part of the party and they were all, there was like Everton's some of the strongest players were all sat in front of me in the main stand. We had Jordan Pickford was there, Amadou Onana was there, new signing Ashley Young was there, and there was a few more as well. So it was like, yeah, we know what you can do, and obviously Abdoulaye Doucouré only came on as a second half substitute as well. So it was almost like, go out there, lads, and show me if you can hack it. We'd have the training throughout the week, and we'd seen what they could do physically, and now we were seeing what they could do in a game situation. As Dyche said, it was real. It was very different than the last time Everton were in that part of the world and in the Austrian side of the Alps when they turned over those
22-0 effort, wasn't it?
I mean, that wasn't beneficial for anyone. It got increasingly embarrassing on all sides. So Tarkowski said they have played this lot before, and they had a go, and that's what you want. You don't want to like roll teams over because nobody learns anything from that. And this team, I mean, although their goal actually was a consolation, Everton were 2-0 and cruising by that point. It's taken them an hour to go ahead. But they had basically a very young back 5 on by that point, and it got a bit of a sloppy defensive moment, and they pulled one back. But yeah, it was almost like the manager saying, "You go out there, lads, and show me what you can do."
And for all that we talk about them, it was actually a couple of probably the academy players that were in the tier beneath the ones that are on the cusp of first-team football that ended up making the difference. Obviously, Francis Okoronkwo came on, he won the penalty, set up the chance for Doucouré, put straight to goalkeeper straight after half-time, and Kate Kouyaté scored a fantastic goal, in fairness. The young
well taken for a young player.
Very well taken. For a player who hasn't been prolific at youth level, although he's been getting more and more opportunities after a few struggles with injuries. Obviously, you have to take these with a degree of pinch of salt. There's no point suggesting that these are players that are going to be leapfrogging and jumping into first-team football. But it's nice. It was nice to be able to see them take their opportunities, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely, and that's what it's there for. I don't think Dyche strikes me as a manager who would undersell the benefits of a pre-season friendly. He's saying about like tactics and stuff. He's going to take every opportunity to work on stuff, so we go into the season, in the best shape we can. I don't think he's just going to put people in places just for the sake of it, or play 4-4-2 just for the sake of it. He's done that for a reason, hasn't he? And within that framework, and especially at the moment, it's with half the players in the stand. We've got a few injuries as well. Yeah, no, that's good. I think I think that's. I think of a few players over the years who've had a good pre-season that you never expected to, come in and done well. So yeah, I think that just getting in around the squad's a good thing, to be honest with you. I think everybody benefits there. How many do progress is a moot point? You don't know, but it might be surprising there.
Yeah, they'll have another opportunity on. I think it's later this week. Trying to remember which date it's on. Obviously, Forest Green for the under-21s, and what was going to be a fixture, pitting them up against Duncan Ferguson's game, and then we have the games on Saturday where obviously the Everton senior squad goes to Wigan, and I think it being under 21s outfit that plays Tranmere. Might be a few opportunity for some fringe players maybe to get a few minutes of Tranmere, do you think, Chris, or do you think it'll very much be a clear distinction?
Yeah, for
Can't name a senior squad at the minute.
Yeah, well, that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, yeah, because you'd be given that's those numbers there, you'd have quite a few youngsters been with the first team. So yeah, the way the club officials were speaking to me, they say it was very much, it's going to be the first teamers at Wigan Athletic, and it's an under 21s fixture at Tranmere Rovers. So they're 2 Everton games at the same time, simultaneously at the weekend, so both 2 o'clock kickoffs. More
opportunity for us to gain some insight as to where Everton are. Hopefully things might have changed. We talk about the transfer window gathering a little bit of momentum over the next few days, so by the time that we're back with you on Friday, maybe we'll have a little bit more news, a few more developments in terms of ingoings and outgoings as well. Well, that's all for the Royal Blue podcast today. So thanks very much for listening. Thanks very much for taking us all, and we really appreciate it. And we'll be back with you on Friday ahead of those games against Tranmere and Wigan.